The morning sun cast long shadows across the Iraqi desert as Captain Sarah Chen adjusted her helmet one final time. In a few hours, she would become the first female pilot in military history to survive what should have been certain death, and her story would unite two nations in the most unexpected way. But first, she had to live through the next 60 minutes of hell that awaited her in the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, the aircraft soldiers lovingly called the Warthog. The alarm pierced through the pre-dawn darkness at Al-Assad Air Base, like a blade cutting through silence. Captain Sarah Chen's eyes snapped open in her cramped quarters, her body already moving before her mind fully registered the sound. After 18 months of deployment, the response had become automatic, feet hitting the cold concrete floor, flight suit pulled on in practiced motions, boots laced with military precision. Outside her window, the first hints of orange painted the horizon over the Iraqi desert. It was March 15, 2019, and what should have been a routine close air support mission would soon become one of the most extraordinary tales of survival and international cooperation in modern military history. Sarah had always been different from her fellow pilots, and not just because she was one of only 12 women flying the A-10 in active combat zones. Where others saw the Warthog as a brute force instrument of war, she saw poetry in its ungainly design. The twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, the distinctive straight wings, the massive GAU-8 cannon that could punch through tank armor. To most, it looked like a flying bathtub built around a gun. To Sarah, it was beautiful in its honest simplicity. "Chen, you're up in 20. Called Major Rodriguez from the doorway of the briefing room as she hurried past. The mission parameters were straightforward enough. Provide close air support for a joint patrol operating near the Syrian border. Intelligence suggested light resistance, mostly small arms fire, and maybe some rocket-propelled grenades. Nothing the Warthog couldn't handle with ease. The briefing room hummed with the familiar pre-mission energy. Maps covered every surface marked with red zones and blue friendly positions. The smell of strong coffee mixed with the metallic scent of equipment being checked and rechecked. Sarah studied the topographical charts, memorizing the terrain features that might save her life if things went wrong. The Euphrates River wound like a silver snake through the landscape, with ancient ruins dotting the countryside, remnants of civilizations that had risen and fallen while empires warred over this same ground. "Weather's going to be clear, visibility unlimited," announced the meteorologist, a thin lieutenant whose predictions had proven remarkably accurate throughout their deployment. Winds from the northwest at 8 knots, temperature climbing to 42 Celsius by midday. Clear weather meant good visibility for target acquisition, but it also meant enemy observers would have no trouble spotting her aircraft. The A-10 wasn't known for its speed or stealth. Its strength lay in its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. As the briefing concluded, Sarah gathered her gear and headed toward the flight line. Her crew chief, Senior Airman Martinez, was already conducting his pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 43 previous combat missions. The sight of her aircraft never failed to stir something deep in her chest. Tail number 780691 had been her mount for the entire deployment, and together they had become a formidable team. "She's purring like a kitten this morning, Captain," Martinez called out, his voice carrying the pride of a master craftsman. Every rivet, every panel, every system had been checked and double-checked. The GAU-8 cannon gleamed in the morning light, its 7 barrels capable of spitting out 70 rounds per second of depleted uranium ammunition. Sarah completed her own walk-around inspection, running her hands along the aircraft's skin, checking for any sign of fatigue or damage. The A-10 bore the scars of previous missions, patched holes from small arms fire, scratches from debris, the kind of battle damage that would have downed any other aircraft. But the Warthog was built to take punishment and keep fighting. Hydraulics are good, flight controls responsive, all weapons systems operational. She reported to Martinez, who made final notations on his clipboard. The trust between pilot and crew chief was absolute. Her life depended on his attention to detail, and he took that responsibility with the seriousness of a sacred oath. The engine start procedure was routine, but never routine. Sarah strapped herself into the cockpit, adjusting the seat and checking the position of every switch and control. The cockpit of an A-10 was Spartanly functional, designed for combat effectiveness rather than comfort. She pulled on her helmet and connected the oxygen line, the familiar hiss of pressurized air filling her ears. "Tower, Hawkeye 7-7, ready for engine start. Hawkeye 7-7, Tower. You're cleared for engine start. Winds are 090 at 8 knots." The twin General Electric turbofans spun up with a rising whine, settling into the steady rumble that would be her constant companion for the next several hours. Sarah ran through her pre-taxi checklist with the same methodical care she'd learned in flight school. Every switch position verified, every gauge reading confirmed, every system tested and found ready. Hawkeye 77, taxi to runway 27 for departure.
Tower, Hawkeye 77, taxi runway 27.
The A-10 rolled forward on its tricycle landing gear, responding to Sarah's control inputs with the solid predictability she'd come to love about the aircraft. Unlike the twitchy fighter jets her Academy classmates flew, the Warthog felt planted, substantial, like a truck with wings. It might not win any beauty contests, but when bullets started flying, there was no aircraft she'd rather be sitting in. At the runway's end, Sarah ran through her final checks. Flight controls moved freely through their full range of motion. Engine parameters showed green across the board. Weapons systems armed and ready. She keyed her radio to check in with the forward air controller, who would guide her to the target area. Badger 3-1, this is Hawkeye 77, checking in with a single A-10. Playtime 3 hours, full load of 30 mic. The voice that answered carried the calm professionalism of a soldier who had done this dance many times before. Hawkeye 77, Badger 3-1. Good to have you up here. We've got some suspicious activity about 12 clicks northeast of Checkpoint Alpha. Stand by for talk on. Sarah acknowledged and pushed the throttles forward. The A-10 accelerated down the runway with deliberate purpose rather than dramatic flair. At rotation speed, she pulled back gently on the stick, and the aircraft lifted off into the crystal-clear morning air. The desert landscape spread out below her like a brown and tan carpet, punctuated by the green ribbon of the Euphrates River. As she climbed to her patrol altitude of 8,000 feet, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of leaving the Earth behind. Up here, away from the complexities and politics of ground operations, everything became clear and simple. Her job was to protect the soldiers below and return safely to base. Everything else was secondary. The radio crackled with updates from the ground controller. The patrol had observed movement around a cluster of buildings that intelligence had flagged as a possible weapons cache. No positive identification yet, but enough suspicious activity to warrant investigation. Sarah adjusted her heading toward the coordinates, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead for any sign of the patrol's position.
Hawkeye 77, I've got your aircraft in sight.
Beautiful morning for flying, isn't it? Sarah smiled despite the tension building in her chest. Forward air controllers were a special breed, maintaining their sense of humor even when death lurked around every corner. That's a firm, Badger. Couldn't ask for better weather. What do you have for me down there? We're observing what appears to be weapons movement between two buildings on the north side of that village cluster. Grid 77845678. Recommend you take a look and see what you think. Sarah banked the A-10 into a gentle turn, lining up for a reconnaissance pass over the target area. Through her binoculars, she could see the buildings in question. Typical Iraqi construction, with flat roofs and concrete walls. Several figures moved between the structures. But from this altitude and distance, positive identification was impossible. I see movement, but I can't make out any weapons from up here. I'm going to drop down for a closer look. Copy that, Hawkeye. Be advised. We've been taking some sporadic small arms fire from that general area. Sarah acknowledged the warning and began a descending turn that would take her down to 4,000 feet for a better view.
As she descended, the details of the landscape became clearer.
The village was typical of rural Iraq, a collection of single-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with narrow alleyways connecting different sections. Palm trees provided some shade, and she could see the glint of solar panels on several rooftops. At 4,000 feet, the picture became clearer. Through her targeting pod, Sarah could see men moving with purpose between the buildings, carrying what appeared to be long objects wrapped in cloth. The movement patterns suggested military training rather than civilian activity, and the wrapped objects were consistent with weapons being moved under concealment. Badger 3-1, I'm seeing coordinated movement consistent with weapons transfer. Count 6 military-age males moving between the northern buildings. They appear to be carrying long objects under wraps. Copy, Hawkeye. That matches what we're seeing from our position. We're going to move in for a closer look. Can you provide overwatch?
Absolutely.
I'll set up a racetrack pattern and keep eyes on the area. Sarah banked the A-10 into a wide oval pattern that would keep the target area under constant observation. From this altitude, she had a commanding view of the entire village and the surrounding countryside. The patrol below would advance under the protection of her watchful presence, knowing that 30mm death could rain down from above at the first sign of hostile action. The morning sun climbed higher, and thermal currents began to build over the desert floor. Sarah made small adjustments to maintain her altitude and position, the A-10's flight controls responding with the steady precision of a well-tuned instrument. Everything felt normal, routine, just another day providing overwatch for a ground patrol in a hostile area. That feeling lasted exactly 17 more minutes. The first indication of trouble came not from her instruments or the radio, but from a glint of reflected sunlight from a ridgeline 3 kilometers to the east. Sarah's trained eyes caught the flash immediately, and her body tensed with the instinct that had kept her alive through dozens of combat missions. Possible reflective object on the eastern ridgeline. She reported to the ground controller, even as she banked the aircraft to get a better angle of view. Copy that, Hawkeye. We don't have any friendlies in that area. Sarah zoomed her targeting pod toward the ridgeline, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. The surface-to-air missile system was setting up on the ridge, its radar dish already beginning to rotate in the characteristic surge pattern. This was no ragtag insurgent group with small arms. This was a sophisticated air defense system operated by trained personnel. Badger 3-1, I've got a SAM site setting up on the eastern ridge. Recommend immediate extraction of ground forces. The words had barely left her mouth when her radar warning receiver exploded into electronic life, filling her headset with the urgent beeping that meant someone was painting her aircraft with targeting radar. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, activating her electronic countermeasures and beginning evasive maneuvers that would make her aircraft a more difficult target to track. But even as she maneuvered, Sarah's tactical mind was processing the implications of what she was seeing. This wasn't a random encounter with an isolated missile system. The positioning was too perfect, the timing too convenient. Someone had known about the patrol and had set up an ambush designed to draw her aircraft into the engagement zone of a sophisticated surface-to-air missile system. The trap was well laid and expertly executed, and she was flying straight into it. Her threat warning system continued its urgent beeping as the SAM site's tracking radar maintained its lock on her aircraft. Sarah pushed the A-10 into a steep diving turn, simultaneously dispensing chaff and flares to confuse any missiles that might already be in the air. The G-forces pressed her into her seat as she maneuvered, but her focus remained absolute. Hawkeye 7 is defensive. SAM launch from the eastern ridge. Through her peripheral vision, Sarah caught sight of the telltale smoke trail of a surface-to-air missile climbing toward her position. The missile was moving fast, accelerating rapidly as its rocket motor burned, but the A-10's low-altitude maneuverability gave her options that faster aircraft wouldn't have had. She pulled the aircraft into a tight turn, simultaneously descending toward the deck where ground clutter might help mask her radar signature. The missile followed, its seeker head tracking her aircraft's heat signature and radar reflection. Sarah dispensed another round of flares and chaff, filling the sky with metallic strips and burning decoys. The missile detonated 200 meters behind and below her aircraft, its proximity fuse triggered by the electronic countermeasures she had deployed. Shrapnel peppered the A-10's rear fuselage, but the aircraft's legendary durability absorbed the damage without losing any critical systems. First missile missed, she reported, even as her threat warning receiver indicated that a second missile had been launched from the same position. This time, Sarah was ready. She had studied the engagement envelope of Russian-made surface-to-air missiles during her intelligence briefings, and she knew that her best chance of survival lay in getting below the minimum engagement altitude of the SAM system. The A-10 dove toward the desert floor, its twin engines screaming at maximum power. The second missile followed her down, its sophisticated guidance system adjusting for her evasive maneuvers. Sarah waited until the last possible moment, then pulled the aircraft into a violent climb, while simultaneously dispensing every electronic countermeasure at her disposal. The missile, confused by the sudden maneuver and the cloud of decoys, lost its lock and detonated harmlessly in the empty air behind her. But Sarah's celebration was short-lived. Her threat warning receiver was now showing multiple radar contacts, and she realized with growing dread that she hadn't stumbled into a single SAM site. She was flying through a complex air defense network that had been carefully positioned to cover all possible escape routes. The voice of the ground controller crackled through her headset, tense with urgency. Hawkeye 7-7, we're seeing multiple hostile contacts converging on your position. Recommend immediate egress to the west. Sarah banked the A-10 toward the recommended escape route, but her tactical display showed what the ground controller couldn't see from his position. The western corridor was blocked by another SAM site, this one already tracking her aircraft and preparing to fire. She was surrounded. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a random encounter or a lucky shot by an insurgent group. This was a carefully planned ambush. executed with military precision by an enemy that had studied her tactics and prepared countermeasures for every option in her playbook. Someone had set a trap specifically designed to kill her and her aircraft, and she had flown straight into it. The third missile launch came from the north, forcing Sarah into another series of violent evasive maneuvers. The A-10 responded to her control inputs with the same steady reliability it had shown throughout their partnership, but Sarah could feel the accumulated damage beginning to affect the aircraft's performance.
Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, and she could hear the subtle changes in engine noise that indicated battle damage.
Badger 3-1, I need immediate support. Multiple SAM sites have me bracketed, and I'm taking damage. Copy, Hawkeye. Fast movers are en route, ETA 15 minutes. In air-to-air combat, 15 minutes was an eternity. Sarah would have to survive 15 more minutes of this deadly game of cat and mouse, with sophisticated missiles hunting her across the Iraqi desert while her aircraft slowly accumulated the damage that would eventually bring her down. She dove toward a dry riverbed, using the natural terrain masking to break radar contact with the SAM sites. For a few precious moments, her threat warning receiver fell silent, giving her time to assess her situation and plan her next move. The A-10 was still flying, but hydraulic pressure was dropping in one system, and she could see smoke streaming from her right engine nacelle. The reprieve lasted exactly 37 seconds. The fourth missile came from directly ahead, launched from a mobile SAM system that had repositioned during her evasive maneuvers. This missile was different, newer, faster, with a more sophisticated seeker head that could distinguish between her aircraft and the countermeasures she had been deploying. Sarah pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn, pushing the damaged aircraft to its limits as she fought for altitude and maneuvering room. The missile followed every move, its guidance system adapting to her tactics with electronic precision. She dispensed her remaining flares and chaff, but the missile ignored the decoys and continued its relentless pursuit. Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched the missile close the final distance to her aircraft. In those last few seconds, she thought about her family back home, about the crew chief who had trusted her to bring his aircraft back safely, about the ground patrol that was counting on her support. The missile detonated 20 meters off her right wing. The explosion was tremendous, a ball of orange fire and black smoke that engulfed the right side of her aircraft. Shrapnel tore through the A-10 structure, severing control lines and puncturing fuel tanks. The right engine wound down with the distinctive whine of a turbine coming apart, and warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel like a deadly Christmas tree. But the A-10 kept flying. Sarah fought to maintain control as the aircraft yawed violently to the right, the asymmetric thrust from her remaining engine trying to put her into an unrecoverable spin. Her right rudder pedal felt mushy, indicating damage to the flight control system, but her left engine continued to run smoothly and the primary flight controls still responded to her inputs. Hawkeye 7-10-7 is hit. Right engine down, multiple systems damaged, but still airborne. The ground controller's voice carried a mixture of relief and concern. Copy, Hawkeye. Can you make it back to base? Sarah scanned her instruments, trying to assess the extent of the damage. Hydraulic pressure was dropping rapidly in both systems, her electrical power was fluctuating, and she could see fuel streaming from multiple holes in her right wing. The A-10 was critically damaged, but it was still flying, still fighting. I'm going to try, she replied, already plotting a course toward the nearest friendly airfield. But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that reaching base would be the least of her challenges. The SAM sites were still active, still tracking her damaged aircraft as she limped away from the ambush site. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice was whispering the truth she didn't want to acknowledge. She wasn't going to make it home. The A-10 Thunderbolt II had lived up to its reputation as the toughest aircraft in the Air Force inventory, absorbing damage that would have destroyed any other plane and continuing to fly. But even the legendary Warthog had its limits, and Sarah could feel those limits approaching with each passing minute. Her fuel was leaking at an alarming rate. Her flight controls were becoming increasingly unresponsive, and the SAM sites were repositioning to cover her escape routes. She was still 40 minutes away from the nearest friendly airfield, and the mathematics of fuel consumption versus distance were not working in her favor. The trap that had been set for her was closing, and despite her skill and her aircraft's legendary toughness, Sarah Chen was running out of options. The morning sun climbed higher over the Iraqi desert, illuminating a drama that was far from over. Sarah's hands gripped the control stick with white-knuckled determination as she nursed the wounded A-10 through the hostile airspace. The aircraft was bleeding fuel from multiple punctures, leaving a visible trail in the clear morning air that any competent pilot could follow straight back to her position. Her right engine was completely dead, the turbine blades frozen in place after the missile's shrapnel had torn through the compressor section. Only her left engine kept her airborne, its steady rumble the only thing standing between her and the unforgiving desert below. The damage assessment was grim. Her primary hydraulic system had failed completely, forcing her to rely on the backup manual reversion system that made every control input feel like wrestling with a mechanical bull. The electrical system was fluctuating wildly, causing her instruments to flicker in and out of operation. Most critically, her fuel flow indicators showed that she was losing aviation fuel at nearly twice the normal consumption rate. "Hawkeye 77, this is Crown," came a new voice over the radio, using the call sign for the airborne command and control aircraft that coordinated air operations over Iraq. "We show you squawking emergency. What's your status?" Sarah keyed her radio, while simultaneously adjusting her heading to avoid another suspected SAM site. "Crown Hawkeye 77. I've taken multiple missile hits, right engine down, multiple system failures, heavy fuel leak. Request immediate vector to nearest emergency landing site." "Copy, Hawkeye. Stand by for vectors. Be advised, we're tracking multiple hostile air defense systems along your current route. Recommend heading 270 for Al-Taqadum." Al-Taqadum was a coalition airbase about 60 kilometers southwest of her current position. But as Sarah calculated her fuel consumption rate against the distance, she realized with growing certainty that she would never make it that far. At her current rate of fuel loss, she had maybe 20 minutes of flight time remaining, and Al-Taqadum was at least 30 minutes away, even if everything went perfectly. The mathematics of survival were unforgiving. "Crown, I don't think I can make Al-Taqadum. Fuel loss is critical. I need something closer." "Hawkeye, closest friendly runway is still Al-Taqadum. There's an emergency strip at Firebase Delta, but it's uncontrolled and only 2,500 feet long." Sarah's mind raced through the options. Firebase Delta was an isolated outpost used primarily for helicopter operations, with a short dirt runway that had never been designed to accommodate fixed-wing aircraft, especially not a battle-damaged A-10 with compromised flight controls. But it was only 15 kilometers away, well within her remaining fuel supply. "Crown, what's the runway surface at Firebase Delta?" "Packed earth and gravel, Hawkeye. It's rated for helicopters and light utility aircraft only." Sarah looked at her fuel gauges again, watching the needles creep steadily toward empty. She had trained for emergency landings on unprepared surfaces, but never in an aircraft this badly damaged. The A-10's landing gear was robust, designed to operate from rough field conditions, but the short runway length would require a perfect approach with virtually no margin for error. "Crown, I'm going to attempt Firebase Delta. Transmit emergency notification." "Copy, Hawkeye. Firebase Delta has been notified. Emergency crews are standing by." As Sarah adjusted her heading toward the firebase, her threat warning receiver came alive again. Another SAM site had acquired her aircraft, and this one was positioned almost directly between her current position and the emergency landing strip. She was being forced to choose between flying through the engagement zone of a hostile missile system or attempting to circle around it and running out of fuel before reaching the runway. The choice was no choice at all. "Crown, I'm showing SAM activity on my direct route to Firebase Delta." "Confirmed, Hawkeye. We're tracking a mobile SAM system approximately 10 kilometers northeast of the firebase. Can you go around?" Sarah checked her fuel gauges one more time and made the calculation that would determine whether she lived or died in the next few minutes. "Negative, Crown. I don't have the fuel for a detour. I'm going straight in." "Copy, Hawkeye. Fast movers are inbound to suppress that SAM site, but they won't arrive for another 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Sarah would be on the ground, one way or another, long before any help arrived. She was going to have to run this gauntlet alone, in a crippled aircraft with failing systems and a rapidly diminishing fuel supply. The A-10 limped across the Iraqi landscape at barely 2,000 feet, low enough to use terrain masking but high enough to avoid most small arms fire from the ground. Sarah could see Firebase Delta in the distance, a small collection of buildings and vehicles surrounded by defensive barriers and watchtowers. The runway looked impossibly short from her current altitude, a thin strip of packed earth that seemed to end almost before it began. Her threat warning receiver began its urgent beeping as the SAM site acquired a targeting lock on her aircraft. Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvers, but the A-10's damaged flight controls made aggressive maneuvering dangerous. Too steep a turn might put the aircraft into an unrecoverable stall, but flying straight and level was essentially presenting herself as a stationary target for the missile system. The missile launch came just as Sarah crested a low ridgeline. She saw the smoke trail climbing toward her position and pushed the aircraft into a shallow dive. trading altitude for airspeed while simultaneously dispensing her last few flares. The missile followed her down, its seeker head locked onto her aircraft's heat signature. Sarah waited until the missile was almost within lethal range, then pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn that stressed the damaged airframe to its limits. She heard metal groaning under the G-forces, and her left engine began to surge as debris worked its way through the intake. The missile detonated 50 meters behind her aircraft, close enough to pepper the fuselage with more shrapnel, but not close enough to bring her down. But the near miss came at a cost. The additional damage from the missile's fragments had severed more control lines and punctured additional fuel cells. Her airspeed was bleeding off rapidly, and she could feel the aircraft beginning to settle toward the ground despite her best efforts to maintain altitude. "Crown, I'm not going to make the runway," Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the desperate nature of her situation. "I'm going to have to put it down in the desert." "Negative, Hawkeye!" Firebase Delta reports the approach is clear. You're only 3 kilometers out. Sarah looked ahead and could see the firebase growing larger in her windscreen, but she could also feel her aircraft dying beneath her. The left engine was running rough now, probably damaged by debris ingestion during her last evasive maneuver. Her airspeed was down to barely 140 knots, dangerously close to the A-10's stall speed with this much battle damage. "I'm losing engine power," she reported. "Number 1 engine is surging badly." As if summoned by her words, her left engine chose that moment to fail completely. The turbine wound down with a mechanical groan, and suddenly Sarah was flying a glider, with all the aerodynamic efficiency of a flying brick. The A-10 immediately began to sink toward the desert floor, its rate of descent increasing with each passing second. Without engine power, Sarah had perhaps 90 seconds of flight time remaining before the aircraft would hit the ground. The farbase was still 2 kilometers away, well beyond her gliding range, even under the best circumstances. She was going to have to find somewhere to put the aircraft down in the unforgiving terrain of the Iraqi desert. The landscape below offered few options. Rocky outcroppings and deep wadis made up most of the terrain, with scattered patches of scrub vegetation marking the few areas flat enough for an emergency landing. Sarah spotted a relatively clear area about a kilometer ahead, a dry lake bed that appeared level enough to give her aircraft a fighting chance of survival. "Crown, I'm dead stick." Attempting emergency landing in the desert, approximately 2 kilometers northeast of Firebase Delta. "Copy, Hawkeye. Search and rescue is launching immediately." Sarah established her final approach to the makeshift landing zone, using every bit of her training and experience to coax the maximum performance from her powerless aircraft. The A-10's heavy wing loading worked against her in the glide, causing the aircraft to sink rapidly toward the ground. She had one chance to get this right. Too high and she would overshoot her landing zone and crash into the rocky terrain beyond. Too low and she would hit the ground short of the clear area and cartwheel into the desert floor. The silence in the cockpit was eerie after hours of engine noise and radio chatter. Without the constant rumble of the turbines, Sarah could hear the whistle of air flowing over the damaged surfaces of her aircraft, and the electronic beeping of warning systems that no longer mattered. Her altimeter unwound steadily as the desert floor rushed up to meet her. At 500 feet above the ground, Sarah could see the details of her chosen landing zone. The dry lake bed was not as smooth as it had appeared from altitude. Rocks and debris were scattered across the surface, and shallow gullies cut through the hardpan. But it was still her best option, and she was committed now. At 200 feet, she lowered the A-10's landing gear, hoping the robust tricycle arrangement would be able to absorb the impact of an unpowered landing on rough terrain. The gear extended with mechanical precision, 3 green lights illuminating on her instrument panel to confirm that the wheels were down and locked. At 100 feet, Sarah pulled back gently on the control stick, raising the aircraft's nose to reduce her descent rate and touchdown speed. The A-10 responded sluggishly to her inputs, its damaged flight controls requiring maximum effort to achieve minimum results. At 50 feet, she could see individual rocks and plants on the desert floor rushing past beneath her aircraft. Her airspeed was down to just over stall speed, the minimum velocity necessary to maintain control of the aircraft. Any slower and the A-10 would simply fall out of the sky. At 20 feet, Sarah pulled back harder on the stick, flaring the aircraft for touchdown. The main landing gear contacted the desert floor with a tremendous impact that sent shockwaves through the entire airframe. The aircraft bounced once, settling back onto the rough surface with a grinding, scraping sound as rocks and debris were thrown up by the spinning wheels. The A-10 rolled across the uneven terrain, its landing gear absorbing punishment that would have collapsed the gear on any other aircraft. Sarah fought to keep the aircraft tracking straight as it decelerated, using differential braking and rudder inputs to avoid the larger obstacles in her path. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only 15 seconds, the aircraft finally rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment, Sarah sat motionless in the cockpit, hardly believing that she was still alive. The silence was profound after the violence of the emergency landing, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the direction of Firebase Delta. She quickly ran through her post-crash checklist, shutting down all systems and ensuring that the aircraft was safe from fire or explosion. Fuel vapors hung heavy in the air around the crash site, creating a dangerous environment that required immediate evacuation from the aircraft. Sarah released her harness and climbed out of the cockpit onto the wing of her battered A-10. The aircraft had absorbed tremendous punishment during the mission and the emergency landing, but it had brought her home alive. The fuselage was peppered with shrapnel holes. Both engines were completely destroyed, and various panels and access doors had been torn away by the violence of combat. But tail number 780691 had done its job. The Warthog had lived up to its legendary reputation for survivability, absorbing damage that would have destroyed any other aircraft and still managing to deliver its pilot safely to the ground. As the rescue helicopter settled into a hover overhead, Sarah looked back at her aircraft one final time. She had expected to feel sadness at seeing her mount so badly damaged, but instead she felt only gratitude. The A-10 had saved her life, and now it would return to service after repairs, ready to protect other pilots in future missions. The helicopter crew lowered a rescue basket, and Sarah climbed aboard for the short flight back to Firebase Delta. As they lifted off, she could see her aircraft sitting alone in the desert, looking like a wounded bird of prey resting on the hardpan. It was a sight she would never forget. But her story was far from over. In fact, the most extraordinary part of her adventure was yet to begin. As the rescue helicopter approached Firebase Delta, Sarah could see unusual activity on the base's small runway. Two aircraft that didn't belong to the coalition forces were parked near the operations building. Sleek, angular fighters that she recognized immediately as F-16 fighting Falcons. But these weren't American aircraft. The distinctive camouflage pattern and national markings identified them as belonging to the Iraqi Air Force. "What are those Iraqi F-16s doing here?" Sarah asked the helicopter crew chief over the intercom. The crew chief, a grizzled sergeant who had seen it all during multiple deployments, shook his head with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Nobody knows, Captain. They showed up about 20 minutes ago, requesting emergency landing clearance. Base commander granted it under international law, but everyone's pretty nervous about having Iraqi military aircraft on the ground." As the helicopter settled onto the landing pad, Sarah could see Iraqi pilots and ground crew personnel standing near their aircraft, clearly as uncertain about the situation as their American counterparts. The tension was palpable even from a distance. Two air forces that had been engaged in combat operations in the same airspace now found themselves sharing the same runway under circumstances that no training manual had ever addressed. Sarah was met at the helicopter by the Firebase commander, Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, a career infantry officer whose experience with air operations was limited to calling in close air support during ground operations. His discomfort with the current situation was evident in his tense posture and clipped speech patterns. "Captain Chen, glad to see you made it down safely. We need to debrief your mission immediately, but we've got a complication." He gestured toward the Iraqi aircraft. "Those F-16s showed up right after we received your emergency call. The pilots claim they were conducting a training mission and experienced mechanical problems that required an emergency landing." Sarah studied the Iraqi aircraft more closely. The F-16s appeared to be in perfect condition, showing none of the signs of mechanical distress that would necessitate an emergency landing. Their weapons pylons were empty, consistent with a training flight, but something about the timing of their arrival didn't feel coincidental. "Sir, what's our protocol for handling foreign military aircraft on a coalition base?" Lieutenant Colonel Matthews rubbed his forehead, clearly dealing with a situation well outside his comfort zone. "International law requires us to provide emergency assistance to any aircraft in distress, regardless of nationality. But these pilots are being pretty evasive about the nature of their emergency, and frankly, I'm not sure what to do with them." As they walked toward the base operations building, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. One of the Iraqi pilots was standing near his aircraft, looking in her direction with an expression of intense interest. When their eyes met, he began walking purposefully toward their group. The pilot was tall and lean, with the confident bearing of an experienced aviator. His flight suit bore the wings and rank insignia of a major in the Iraqi Air Force, and his English, when he spoke, was accented but precise. "Excuse me," he said. addressing Sarah directly. "Are you the pilot of the A-10 that was shot down this morning?" Sarah exchanged glances with Lieutenant Colonel Matthews before answering. "I'm Captain Chen, and yes, I was flying the A-10 that made the emergency landing." The Iraqi pilot's expression became even more intense. "Captain, I need to ask you about your aircraft. What was the tail number?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about the pilot's tone and the specificity of his question that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere she might not want to go, but military protocol required her to answer. "Tail number 780691. "Why do you ask?" The Iraqi pilot was quiet for a long moment, staring at Sarah with an expression that seemed to combine recognition, surprise, and something that might have been respect. When he finally spoke, his words would change everything Sarah thought she knew about her morning's adventure. "Captain Chen," he said slowly, "my name is Major Rashid Al-Mansouri, and I need to tell you something about your aircraft that you're not going to believe." The late morning sun beat down on the small group standing on the runway at Firebase Delta. American and Iraqi military personnel facing each other in a situation that defied all conventional protocols. Sarah waited for Major Al-Mansouri to continue, sensing that whatever he was about to say would fundamentally alter her understanding of the morning's events. "Captain," Major Al-Mansouri began, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to reveal a closely guarded secret, "your A-10, tail number 780691, has a history that connects our two air forces in a way that very few people know about." Lieutenant Colonel Matthews stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "Major, I'm going to need you to explain exactly what you're talking about, and I'm going to need you to do it very carefully." Major Al-Mansouri raised his hands slightly, a gesture of non-aggression that seemed practiced and sincere. "Colonel, I understand your concern, but please hear me out. What I'm about to tell you will explain why my wingman and I diverted from our training mission to land at your base." Sarah felt a growing sense of surreal anticipation. The morning had already been filled with more drama and danger than most pilots experienced in an entire deployment, but something told her that the most extraordinary part of her story was just beginning. 26 years ago, Major Al-Mansouri continued. During the Gulf War, that same A-10, tail number 780691, saved the life of my father. The silence that followed Major Al-Mansouri's words stretched like a taut wire across the runway at Firebase Delta. Sarah felt the world shift slightly on its axis, as the implications of what the Iraqi pilot had just said began to sink in. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews looked as though he had been struck by lightning, his hand still hovering near his sidearm, but his aggressive posture softening into one of confused fascination. "That's impossible," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That aircraft has been in service for over 4 decades, but the chances of it being the same one that—" "I know it sounds impossible, Captain," Major Al-Mansouri interrupted gently. "But I have spent years researching this story, and when I heard over the radio that an A-10 with that specific tail number was in distress this morning, I knew I had to be here." Lieutenant Colonel Matthews stepped forward, his training taking over despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "Major Al-Mansouri, I'm going to need you to provide some documentation and verification before we can accept what you're telling us. This could be some kind of intelligence operation." Major Al-Mansouri nodded with understanding. "Of course, Colonel. I would expect nothing less." He reached into his flight suit and withdrew a worn leather portfolio. "I carry copies of the official records, both American and Iraqi, documenting the incident I'm referring to." As Major Al-Mansouri opened the portfolio, Sarah noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. Whatever story he was about to tell clearly held deep personal significance for him. He withdrew several documents, some bearing official military seals, and others that appeared to be photocopied from historical archives. February 26, 1991. Major Al-Mansouri began, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone reciting a well-rehearsed account. The ground phase of Operation Desert Storm. My father, then Lieutenant Khalil Al-Mansouri of the Iraqi Republican Guard, was part of a tank column retreating north along Highway 80. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Highway 80 had been the scene of one of the most controversial episodes of the Gulf War, when coalition aircraft had attacked a massive convoy of retreating Iraqi vehicles. The images of the destroyed convoy, later dubbed the Highway of Death by the media, had become iconic symbols of the conflict's destructive power. My father's T-72 tank had been disabled by coalition aircraft earlier that morning, Major Al-Mansouri continued. He and his crew were trying to reach friendly lines on foot when they came under attack from coalition helicopters. They took shelter in a damaged building, but the helicopters continued to circle, waiting for them to move. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews examined the documents that Major al-Mansouri had provided. The papers appeared genuine, bearing the official seals of both the U.S. Air Force and the Iraqi Ministry of Defense. One document in particular caught his attention: a detailed after-action report from the 23rd Tactical Fighter Wing, documenting close air support operations in the Kuwait Theater of Operations on February 26, 1991. According to this report, Lieutenant Colonel Matthews said slowly, an A-10 aircraft, tail number 780691, piloted by Captain William Rodriguez, engaged multiple targets along Highway 80 during the morning hours of February 26th. Major al-Mansouri nodded. Captain Rodriguez was my father's angel that day, though neither of them knew it at the time. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the incredible coincidence that was unfolding before her. The aircraft she had been flying that morning, the same machine that had saved her life through its legendary toughness and reliability, had apparently been involved in saving the life of an Iraqi soldier more than 2 decades earlier. "Tell us what happened," Sarah said, surprised by the intensity of her own voice. Major al-Mansouri's eyes took on a distant quality as he continued his father's story. "The helicopters had my father and his men pinned down for over an hour. They were running low on ammunition and water, and it was clear that the helicopters were going to wait them out. My father was preparing to surrender when they heard the sound of jet engines approaching from the south." He paused, consulting one of the documents in his portfolio. According to the official records, Captain Rodriguez was conducting armed reconnaissance along Highway 80 when he observed what his report describes as helicopter gunships engaging dismounted personnel who appeared to be attempting to surrender. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews looked up from the documents he was reviewing. The rules of engagement during Desert Storm were very specific about engaging personnel who were attempting to surrender.
Exactly, Major al-Mansouri replied.
Captain Rodriguez ordered the helicopters to break off their attack and allow the Iraqi soldiers to surrender properly. When the helicopter pilots refused to comply, Captain Rodriguez positioned his A-10 between the helicopters and my father's position.
Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she imagined the scene.
An American A-10 pilot risking his own career and possibly his life to protect Iraqi soldiers who were trying to surrender according to the Geneva Convention.
It was the kind of moral courage that defined the best traditions of military aviation. The helicopters eventually departed, Major al-Mansouri continued, and my father and his men were able to surrender to coalition ground forces.
They were processed as prisoners of war and repatriated to Iraq after the ceasefire.
He withdrew another document from his portfolio, this one bearing the letterhead of the International Committee of the Red Cross.
This is my father's prisoner of war record, documenting his capture and eventual release. But the most important part of the story happened 20 years later. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews looked up with interest. 20 years later? 2011. My father was working as a translator for coalition forces in Baghdad. He had learned English during his time as a prisoner of war and had become an advocate for reconciliation between Iraq and the United States. One day, he met an American pilot who was visiting Iraq as part of a military exchange program. Major al-Mansouri reached into his portfolio and withdrew a photograph, slightly faded with age but still clear enough to show 2 men standing in front of an A-10 Thunderbolt II. One was clearly an Iraqi civilian, while the other wore the flight suit of a U.S. police. Air Force pilot. The American pilot was Colonel William Rodriguez, now retired, Major al-Mansouri said, his voice thick with emotion. When my father learned his name and saw his A-10, he realized that this was the man who had saved his life 20 years earlier. Sarah took the photograph and studied it carefully. The American pilot looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and the confident bearing of an experienced aviator. The Iraqi man beside him was smiling broadly, his arm around the American pilot's shoulders in a gesture of unmistakable friendship and gratitude. My father told Colonel Rodriguez the story of what had happened that day on Highway 80. Major al-Mansouri continued. At first, Colonel Rodriguez didn't remember the specific incident. He had flown so many missions during the war. But when my father described the helicopter engagement and the specific time and location, Colonel Rodriguez consulted his own logbooks and confirmed that he had indeed been flying tail number 780691 that morning. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews shook his head in amazement. The coincidence is incredible. That's what Colonel Rodriguez said, Major al-Mansouri replied with a slight smile. But my father told him that in his culture, Such coincidences are not random. They are signs that lives are connected across time and distance by invisible threads of fate. Sarah found herself deeply moved by the story, but a practical question occurred to her. Major Al-Mansouri, how did you know that I was flying that specific aircraft this morning? Major Al-Mansouri's expression became more serious. Captain Chen, I must tell you something that may be difficult for you to hear. The ambush you flew into this morning was not random. Iraqi intelligence had been tracking coalition air operations in this sector for several weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews immediately tensed, his hand moving back towards his sidearm. Major, are you telling us that Iraqi forces were responsible for the SAM attack this morning?
Not Iraqi forces, Colonel.
Major Al-Mansouri replied quickly. Iranian-backed militias operating in the border region. They have been trying to provoke an international incident by attacking coalition aircraft with sophisticated weapons supplied by Iran. Sarah's mind raced as she processed this new information. The carefully coordinated nature of the ambush, the sophisticated missile systems, the precise timing, it all made sense if the attack had been planned and executed by well-trained militia forces with access to advanced weapons. My government has been tracking these militia activities, Major Al-Mansouri continued, and we had intelligence suggesting that they were planning an attack this morning. When we learned from monitoring coalition radio frequencies that the target aircraft was tail number 780691, I requested permission to divert from our training mission. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews looked skeptical. And your government just let you fly into coalition-controlled airspace to warn us about the ambush? Major Al-Mansouri smiled grimly. Colonel, my government has been trying to improve relations with the coalition for years. When I explained the historical significance of that particular aircraft and its connection to my family, my commanding officer saw an opportunity to demonstrate Iraqi goodwill toward coalition forces. Sarah looked at the photograph again, studying the faces of the two men who had found friendship and understanding despite having once been enemies. Major, are you saying that you and your wingman diverted from your mission to help me? Captain Chen, when I heard that the aircraft my father called his guardian angel was in danger, I could not simply continue with a routine training flight. My wingman and I immediately requested vectors toward your position. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews consulted his watch and then looked at the tactical display in the operations building. Major, our records show that coalition fast movers engaged and destroyed 3 SAM sites in the area where Captain Chen was attacked. Are you telling me that was Iraqi aircraft? Major Al-Mansouri nodded. My wingman and I arrived at the engagement zone approximately 12 minutes after Captain Chen's emergency call. We located and engaged the militia SAM sites while your coalition aircraft was still en route to the area. Sarah felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted once again. She had assumed that American or coalition aircraft had eliminated the missile threats that had been hunting her across the desert. The idea that Iraqi F-16 pilots had risked their lives and their careers to save her was almost too incredible to believe. But why didn't you identify yourselves over the radio? Sarah asked. Major Al-Mansouri's expression became uncomfortable. Captain, if we had announced over coalition frequencies that Iraqi military aircraft were engaging targets in the same airspace where a coalition pilot was under attack, the situation could have escalated into a major international incident. My government wanted to help, but they also wanted to avoid any possibility of misunderstanding. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews studied the Iraqi pilot carefully. Major, I'm going to need to verify your story through official channels before I can accept what you're telling us. But assuming it's true, you and your wingman may have saved Captain Chen's life this morning. Colonel, that aircraft saved my father's life 26 years ago. If my wingman and I were able to return the favor this morning, then perhaps my father was right about fate connecting our lives across time and distance. Sarah looked out across the runway at the 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons that had brought Major Al-Mansouri to Firebase Delta. The sleek fighters looked almost toy-like compared to her battered A-10, still sitting alone in the desert where she had crash-landed it. But appearances could be deceiving. Those F-16s had apparently fought their way through hostile airspace to eliminate the threats that had been hunting her. Major Al-Mansouri, Sarah said slowly, I owe you and your wingman a debt that I can never repay. The Iraqi pilot shook his head. Captain Chen, my father taught me that courage and honor are not limited by nationality or politics. You were flying that aircraft this morning with the same dedication to protecting others that Captain Rodriguez showed 206 years ago. My wingman and I were simply honoring that tradition. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews cleared his throat. Major, I'm going to need to establish contact with your headquarters to coordinate your departure from this base. This situation is well above my pay grade, and I'm going to need guidance from much higher authority. Major Al-Mansouri nodded. Of course, Colonel. I understand that this situation is unprecedented. My government is prepared to provide full documentation and official confirmation of everything I've told you. As the group began walking toward the operations building, Sarah found herself thinking about the incredible chain of events that had brought them all together on this small runway in the Iraqi desert. A single aircraft, built decades ago in an American factory, had somehow become the focal point of a story that spanned generations and bridged the gap between former enemies. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across Firebase Delta when the encrypted satellite phone in the operations building finally rang with the call Lieutenant Colonel Matthews had been waiting for. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Matthews providing detailed reports to what sounded like very senior officials at multiple levels of the military hierarchy. When he finally hung up the phone, Lieutenant Colonel Matthews looked like a man who had just received confirmation of something he had barely dared to believe. Major Al-Mansouri, I have official confirmation from both U.S. Central Command and the Iraqi Ministry of Defense regarding your story and your actions this morning. Major Al-Mansouri straightened slightly, the posture of a professional military officer receiving important news. And what is their assessment, Colonel? Both governments have confirmed that your account is accurate and that your intervention this morning prevented what could have been a major international incident. The Iranian-backed militias responsible for the SAM attacks were apparently trying to provoke a larger conflict by downing coalition aircraft. Sarah felt a wave of relief, mixed with gratitude. The confirmation meant that Major Al-Mansouri's incredible story was true and that she owed her life not just to the legendary toughness of her A-10, but to the courage and dedication of two Iraqi pilots who had risked everything to honor a debt from a previous generation. There's more, Lieutenant Colonel Matthews continued. Both governments have agreed that this incident should be documented and publicized as an example of military cooperation and mutual respect between former adversaries. Captain Chen, you and Major Al-Mansouri are going to be asked to participate in joint press conferences and possibly a documentary film about the incident. Major Al-Mansouri turned to Sarah with an expression of sincere respect. Captain, would you be willing to meet my father when this situation is resolved? He has wanted to thank the pilot of that A-10 again ever since Colonel Rodriguez returned to the United States. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the full emotional impact of the morning's events finally caught up with her. She had survived a sophisticated ambush, crash-landed in the desert, and discovered that her aircraft had a history that connected her to a story of courage and redemption that spanned decades. Major Al-Mansouri, I would be honored to meet your father. And I want to thank you and your wingman again for what you did this morning. You saved my life. The Iraqi pilot smiled and extended his hand. Captain Chen, my father always said that aircraft tail number 780691 was blessed. After this morning's events, I think he was right. Sarah shook Major Al-Mansouri's hand, feeling the firmness of his grip and the sincerity of his words. Around them, American and Iraqi personnel worked side by side to coordinate the departure of the F-16s and the recovery of her crashed A-10. The sight of former enemies cooperating so seamlessly was perhaps the most remarkable thing she had witnessed in a morning full of remarkable events. As the sun began to set over Firebase Delta, Sarah stood on the runway watching the Iraqi F-16s prepare for departure. Major Al-Mansouri and his wingman had completed all the necessary paperwork and received clearance for their return flight to Iraq. The political and diplomatic implications of the morning's events would continue to reverberate through both governments for weeks to come, but the human story was already complete. Major Al-Mansouri approached her one final time before climbing into his cockpit. Captain Chen, I want you to know that you are now part of my family's story. My father will be very proud to learn that the Guardian Angel aircraft found another worthy pilot to carry on its tradition of protecting others. Sarah nodded, too moved to trust her voice for a moment. Finally, she managed to speak. Major, please tell your father that it was an honor to fly his Guardian Angel aircraft, and that I hope someday our families can meet under happier circumstances. The Iraqi pilot smiled and saluted, a gesture of professional respect that Sarah returned with equal formality. Then he climbed into his F-16 and began his engine start procedures for the flight home. As the two Fighting Falcons rolled down the short runway and lifted off into the desert evening, Sarah thought about the incredible story that she would soon have to tell. Her crashed A-10, tail number 780691, would be recovered and repaired, eventually returning to service to protect other pilots in future missions. But more importantly, It would carry with it a legacy of courage and honor that transcended national boundaries and political differences. The Warthog had lived up to its reputation once again, not just as a supremely survivable combat aircraft, but as a bridge between former enemies who had found common ground in their shared respect for military professionalism and human dignity. As the last traces of the F-16's contrails faded into the evening sky, Sarah Chen knew that she had been part of something much larger than a simple combat mission gone wrong. She had been a participant in a story that proved the best traditions of military aviation could inspire courage and friendship even between those who had once been sworn enemies. The Guardian Angel aircraft would fly again, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of pilots from two nations who had learned that honor and courage recognized no borders. And somewhere in Baghdad, an aging Iraqi veteran would smile with pride when he learned that his Guardian Angel had found another worthy pilot to protect and inspire. The desert wind carried the sound of helicopter rotors as the recovery team arrived to begin the complex process of retrieving Sarah's damaged A-10 from its resting place in the dry lake bed. But the most important recovery had already taken place. The recovery of faith in the human capacity for understanding and forgiveness across the deepest divides of history and politics. As Sarah climbed aboard the helicopter for the flight back to Al Asad Air Base, she looked back one more time at Firebase Delta, where the impossible had become reality and former enemies had become friends through the shared language of military honor and mutual respect. The story of tale number 780691 would continue, but this chapter would always be remembered as the day when a crashed Warthog became a bridge between two worlds, proving that some things are indeed more powerful than the forces that divide us. In the distance, the Iraqi desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, holding secrets and stories that connected the present to the past and the future, to the dreams of those brave enough to believe that understanding was possible even in the midst of conflict. The Guardian Angel aircraft had earned its wings once again. They shot down her Warthog. Then the F-16 pilots paused at the tail number.